Welcome to Postum SDA Cast. Join Julien and Megan as they dive into history, theology, politics, and the future of Seventh-day Adventism. Thinking outside the box and brewing bold conversations. Let's sip, chat, and explore.
Welcome to another deep dive, you guys. Today we're going to be unpacking the life and work of Ellen G. White.
Oh, yeah.
A very central figure in the Seventh-day Adventist Church.
Mm-hmm.
You've probably heard of her, known for her prophetic visions,
Right.
Messages that many believe came straight from God.
Mm-hmm.
But today we're examining a slightly different angle. We're going to be looking at the question of, were her visions truly divine?
Right.
Or were they maybe influenced by some of the very strong personalities that surrounded her in those early years?
That's a fascinating question, and it really gets at, how much personal experiences and interactions can end up shaping someone's spiritual understanding.
Yeah.
Especially when you're talking about a new religious movement like early Adventism.
Absolutely. We're not trying to discredit anyone, but more to understand the context in which these visions emerged.
Exactly.
So let's rewind the clock a little bit.
Okay.
Back to Ellen's early years. She was only 12 when she first encountered the preaching of William Miller.
William Miller, yeah. He was really, fervently predicting the second coming of Christ.
Yeah.
And created quite a stir back then.
Oh, absolutely.
But it's not surprising that a young, impressionable Ellen was just totally swept up in his message.
Right.
In fact, her family even left their church to join the growing Adventist movement because of it.
Okay, so Miller clearly planted a very powerful seed here.
Yes.
Exposing Ellen to this intense expectation of Christ's return.
Absolutely.
I mean, it really makes you think, how much did this early experience kind of lay the groundwork for her later visions?
Right. And it's not just about Miller. As the Adventist movement started to grow, so did the number of influential figures kind of vying for leadership within the movement.
Sure.
So let's fast forward just a bit to 1845 and introduce Joseph Turner.
Okay.
A pretty prominent figure in Adventist circles back then.
Yeah.
He published an article outlining his understanding of Christ's movement in a heavenly sanctuary.
And this is where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
Because not long after Turner's article, Ellen has this vision that seems to echo a lot of his ideas about this heavenly sanctuary.
Right.
But there's a twist.
There is.
Turner later questions the authenticity of her visions.
Oh, wow.
Even going so far as to accuse her of mesmerism.
Mesmerism. Whoa.
Like she was being hypnotized or something.
That's a big accusation.
It really is.
Yeah.
So it's this very intriguing turn of events.
Yeah.
On the one hand, we have this apparent alignment between Turner's ideas and Ellen's vision.
Right.
But on the other hand, you have Turner himself casting doubt on where that vision came from.
Right.
So what do we make of this?
Yeah.
Was it a genuine independent revelation on Ellen's part?
Yeah.
Or was there something else at play?
It's like a puzzle
Yeah.
with some missing pieces, and,
Right.
to make things even more complicated. Isaac Welcome,
Okay.
another prominent Adventist at the time, observed that a lot of Ellen's visions seemed to mirror the teachings of leaders like Turner.
Yeah, that definitely adds fuel to the fire.
Yeah. It raises some important questions about the origin of these visions.
For sure.
Were they truly like messages from God, or were they more like a product of the kind of theological discussions and ideas that were circulating within the movement at the time?
Yeah, it's a very blurry line. Now let's bring in another character to this story.
Okay.
William Foy.
William Foy.
Like Ellen Foy was also a prominent Adventist figure. And get this, he also claimed to have prophetic visions.
Oh, wow.
So you've got a crowded stage now.
You do?
Yeah, and it gets even more fascinating.
Okay.
There's this story about Foy attending a meeting where Ellen was sharing one of her visions.
Mm-hmm.
So as she's describing this vision, Foy suddenly jumps up and declares that he's seen the exact same thing.
Oh, wow. That's quite a scene.
Almost pretty dramatic.
Yeah.
So two prophets, same vision.
Right.
They join forces.
Right.
Become this dynamic prophetic duo.
Well, not quite. Foy later distanced himself from Ellen, and he even went so far as to copyright his own visions.
Really?
It makes you wonder if there was some kind of rivalry brewing.
Yeah.
Or maybe if, they were both tapping into some kind of shared source of inspiration.
Right.
Rather than, a direct revelation from God.
It's like they were both hearing the same rumors.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so we've got Miller's second coming prophecies. We've got Turner's ideas about the heavenly sanctuary.
Right.
Foy's competing visions.
Yeah.
Who else enters the picture in these kind of formative years?
Well, this is where a really influential figure enters the scene.
Okay.
Joseph Bates.
Ah.
He was known for his strong views on Sabbath observance,
Okay.
the mark of the beast, and the seal of God.
Right.
These are all concepts that would eventually become really central to Seventh-day Adventist theology.
Right, and those weren't really settled doctrines at that point.
No, not at all.
In early Adventism.
Yeah.
So I'm sensing a potential clash here with Ellen, especially since Bates had such strong opinions.
Yes, he did. He was very persuasive and very eager to kind of convert others to his way of thinking.
So how did this play out?
Well, when the Whites, that's Ellen and her husband James, first met Bates, they were going through a really difficult time, facing some financial strain and looking for support.
Right.
And Bates, being the persuasive figure that he was,
Right.
saw an opportunity to bring the Whites, and especially Ellen with her prophetic claims, into his camp.
Right, because if her visions start backing up his ideas,
Exactly.
then that really solidifies things for him.
Exactly.
So at this point, the Whites hadn't really fully embraced Bates's views.
Right.
But how did that change over time?
Well, that's where things get even more interesting.
Okay, so you've got this very fascinating dynamic developing.
Yeah.
The Whites are facing hardship. Bates is this strong personality with his own theological convictions. And then you have Ellen having these visions. So did her visions somehow end up aligning with Bates's ideas?
Right.
Or did she kind of hold her ground?
Well, this is where the story takes another interesting turn.
Okay.
So while they were initially resistant, the Whites actually eventually come around to Bates's way of thinking.
Okay.
They embrace his views on the Sabbath, on the mark of the beast, and wouldn't you know it,
Yeah.
this shift coincides with Ellen starting to have visions that support those very ideas.
Wait a minute. So they adopt Bates's beliefs and then boom, Ellen's visions start to back them up.
It's quite a coincidence.
The timing seems awfully convenient.
It does.
Like, what are the odds?
It's definitely a pattern that makes you raise an eyebrow.
Yeah.
And it gets even more intriguing when you consider that Bates himself initially had some reservations about Ellen's visions.
Okay.
That is, until she had a vision about astronomy.
Oh, okay.
A subject that he was deeply interested in.
Right.
And this vision very conveniently aligned with his pre-existing beliefs about the cosmos.
Okay, now that's just way too much of a coincidence.
It is.
First the Sabbath and the mark of the beast.
Right.
And now we have this astronomy vision that just so happens to validate Bates' personal views.
Right.
It makes you think, were these visions really messages from God?
Yeah.
Or were they somehow shaped by the beliefs of the people around her?
Yeah.
Especially someone as persuasive as Bates.
It's a good question, and there's another layer to this astronomy vision that makes things even more complicated.
Okay.
It includes a detail about Jupiter.
Okay.
That while it was consistent with the scientific understanding at the time, has since been proven inaccurate.
So a vision with a factual error?
Yeah.
That seems like a pretty big issue.
It does.
For the divine inspiration theory.
It definitely challenges the idea that Ellen's visions were, infallible and came directly from God.
Right.
Some might argue that even prophets can be influenced by, the scientific understanding of their time. But it does raise some tricky questions.
It definitely casts some doubt.
Yeah.
It seems like every time we turn a corner in this story, we're finding more evidence that these visions might be more about human influence than divine revelation.
And this leads us to perhaps the most significant figure in Ellen's life.
Okay.
Someone whose influence really can't be overstated.
Go.
Her husband, James White.
Ah, James White. He was a major driving force in the early Adventist movement. He was a real powerful personality.
Absolutely.
But how did he shape Ellen's visions?
Right.
I mean, was he just a supportive partner, or was there something more complicated going on?
Well, there are some accounts that suggest that James had a very active role, perhaps even exerting a degree of control over Ellen and her visions.
That's a pretty serious claim.
It is.
Do we have any specifics about what that actually looked like?
We do. There's another really fascinating perspective that comes from D.M. Canright.
Okay.
He was a close associate of the Whites, but he later left the Adventist Church.
Okay.
And became quite a vocal critic.
Got it.
And in his writings, Canright claims that James and other kind of prominent figures would get together, they would discuss, develop theological ideas.
Okay.
And it was only after these discussions that Ellen would then have a vision that seemed to confirm their already established beliefs.
So if Canright is to be believed, these visions weren't so much divine revelations as they were kind of a way to validate the ideas that were already circulating within this inner circle.
Exactly, like a stamp of approval from heaven.
Wow. Okay, now let's talk about something that's still super central to the Adventist Church today. Health reform, you know, this emphasis on a vegetarian diet, no caffeine, all that stuff. Did Ellen receive divine guidance on this as well? Or was there another source for these ideas?
This is another area where Ellen's prophetic claims kind of intersect with the broader cultural trends of her time. So prior to 1863, the Whites hadn't really shown that much interest in health reform. But that year, their sons contracted diphtheria.
Oh, no.
And in their desperation to find a cure, James discovered the work of Dr. James Jackson, who was a big proponent of what was then called hygienic medicine.
So they turned to Dr. Jackson in a time of crisis.
They do.
What happened next?
Well, it seems that Dr. Jackson's methods really resonated with the Whites. They became very invested in his teachings. They adopted his health practices. They even visited his clinic in Dansville, New York, where they learned more about his emphasis on a plant-based diet, avoiding stimulants like coffee and tea, the importance of fresh air and exercise, all these things.
So the Whites basically become disciples,
in a way,
of Dr. Jackson's health reform movement. But where do Ellen's visions fit into all of this?
Well, here's the really interesting part. Shortly after immersing themselves in Dr. Jackson's teachings, Ellen starts having visions about health. And these visions quite remarkably align with the very principles that Dr. Jackson was advocating.
So divine revelation on health. Or just the adoption and repackaging of existing ideas.
It's hard to say.
It really is.
It's a tough one.
It's becoming harder and harder to ignore this pattern we're seeing.
I know.
Of Ellen's visions kind of mirroring the beliefs of those she's closely associated with.
Exactly. And this brings us to a really pivotal event in Adventist history. The 1888 General Conference. This conference saw the emergence of a message focused on righteousness by faith. A concept that was championed by two young ministers, A.T. Jones and E.J. Wagoner.
Righteousness by faith. I mean, that's a pretty fundamental Christian doctrine.
It is.
It seems strange that it wouldn't have been a central part of Adventist teaching from the get-go.
You would think so. And yet, up until this point, it was notably absent from Ellen White's teachings.
That's so interesting.
And her writings.
So how did Ellen, the prophet of the Adventist movement, react to this seemingly new message?
Well, initially she embraced it wholeheartedly. She even went so far as to claim that this righteousness by faith message was what she had been preaching for the past 45 years.
Hold on, 45 years? But if that was true, then why was it such a novel concept at the 1888 conference?
Exactly.
It seems like it should have been there all along.
It should have been a cornerstone. And when you look at her earlier writings, there's very little, if any, mention of this doctrine. It's almost as if this righteousness by faith message, after being introduced by Jones and Wagoner, suddenly becomes integrated into her prophetic pronouncements.
So yet again, we see this pattern of Ellen seemingly adopting a newly popular idea and presenting it as divine revelation.
You got it.
Wow.
And there's another twist. Despite Ellen's initial strong endorsement of Jones and Wagoner, they both eventually ended up rejecting her prophetic claims and leaving the Adventist Church.
Wow.
It seems that even those who initially influenced her ended up questioning the validity of her visions.
That's incredible. This story just keeps getting more and more complicated.
It does.
We've gone from William Miller's Second Coming prophecies to Joseph Bates' strong convictions about the Sabbath and the Mark of the Beast to James White's potential control over Ellen's visions to the adoption of Dr. Jackson's health reform ideas and now this whole righteousness by faith controversy. It's hard to keep track of all the twists and turns.
It is a complex narrative. It's full of fascinating characters and events.
It is.
But as we kind of weave our way through it, a very clear pattern starts to emerge. Ellen White's visions, rather than being isolated instances of divine revelation, consistently align with the prevailing beliefs and ideas of these influential figures who surrounded her.
Okay, before we get to the heart of what this all means,
Okay.
let's take a second to just recap everything.
Good idea.
Yeah.
It's easy to get lost in the details of this fascinating story.
It really is. So we started with the huge impact
Yeah.
of William Miller's Second Coming predictions
Right.
on a young Ellen Harmon.
Mm-hmm.
Then we explored that very curious case of Joseph Turner,
Yeah.
whose ideas about the heavenly sanctuary
Right.
seemed to be echoed in one of Ellen's early visions,
Right.
only for him to later question her authenticity.
Right. What a strange turn of events.
It really is.
Yeah.
And we can't forget William Foy.
Right. Another self-proclaimed prophet who claimed to have the same vision as Ellen.
Right.
You know, just further muddying the waters of
Yeah.
this whole divine inspiration question.
Absolutely. And then we dug into the very significant influence of Joseph Bates,
Yes.
particularly his views about Sabbath observance and the mark of the beast. Views that the whites initially pushed back on,
Yeah.
but then eventually adopted,
Yeah.
with Ellen conveniently receiving visions
Of course.
that backed up those very doctrines.
Yeah.
And let's not forget that astronomy visions
Yes. The one with the factual error.
that align so perfectly with Bates' interests.
Exactly.
It really raises questions about the true source of those visions.
Absolutely.
And then there's the influence of James White, her husband,
Right.
powerful figure in his own right,
Yes.
with some accounts suggesting that he actually exerted some control
Yeah.
over her prophetic pronouncements.
Yeah. It's a troubling thought.
It is.
Yeah.
And we even talked about how Ellen's teachings on health reform
Right.
almost perfectly aligned with the ideas of Dr. James Jackson,
Right.
whose methods the whites embraced after their sons got sick.
It's quite a pattern.
It is.
Yeah.
And then finally, we looked at this whole righteousness by faith situation
Yes. At the 1888
at
conference.
the 1888 conference.
Yes.
Despite claiming to have preached this doctrine for decades,
Right.
Ellen White's earlier writings tell a totally different story.
They do.
It's like this core Christian concept
Right.
suddenly became a central part of her message
Yeah.
after it was introduced by Jones and Wagoner.
Exactly as if she was catching up on the latest theological trends.
It's a lot to process,
It is.
but I think it really paints a compelling picture.
It does.
Ellen White's visions seem less like divine revelations and more like a reflection of her environment and the beliefs of those closest to her.
That's a conclusion that many have reached after examining the evidence.
Right.
But the question remains,
Yeah.
what are the implications of this?
Right.
If her visions weren't truly divine messages,
Right.
then what does that mean for her role in the Adventist Church
Right.
and the origins of its doctrines?
Yeah.
We'll explore those questions in the final part of our deep dive.
Okay. It's been quite the journey tracing the origins of Ellen G. White's prophetic claims, and it seems like we've uncovered more questions than answers.
Well, that's often the case, when you start digging deep into these complex historical figures
Right.
and these religious movements.
Yeah.
It's not always about finding a nice, neat answer.
Right.
It's more about exploring the different perspectives,
Yeah.
grappling with the nuances of the evidence.
Yeah, you're right. It's easy to kind of get caught up
Yeah,
in wanting a clear-cut, yes or no,
right.
but the reality is always much more messy.
Messier, much more complex.
So let's dive into those complex questions you mentioned.
Okay.
If Ellen White's visions were so heavily influenced by the people and ideas around her,
Right.
what does that tell us about her role in the Adventist Church?
I think it suggests that her role was perhaps more complex and multifaceted than how it's traditionally been portrayed.
Okay.
Instead of just being this passive vessel
Yeah.
for divine messages, she might have been an active participant
Okay.
in shaping Adventist theology,
Where?
even if it was unconsciously.
Yeah.
Her visions, while reflecting the beliefs of those around her, they provided this powerful form of validation.
Right.
It gave these ideas this divine stamp of approval.
So in a sense, her visions kind of functioned as a tool
Yeah,
for solidifying these beliefs and establishing authority within the movement.
exactly. And it's so fascinating to consider how religious authority is constructed,
Right.
and how claims of divine revelation can be used to legitimize certain interpretations of
Wow.
Scripture or, specific doctrines.
Yeah.
In this case, it seems like Ellen White's visions, while they may have been sincere,
Yeah.
they really did play a significant role in shaping the very fabric
Right.
of Adventist beliefs.
This makes me think about the broader implications for understanding religious movements in general. It seems like the lines between personal beliefs, social influences, and claims of divine revelation
Yeah.
can get very blurry.
They really can. And it's not just about Adventism.
Right.
I mean, throughout history, we see how religious leaders and their teachings are often shaped
Right.
by the cultural and intellectual currents of their time.
Absolutely.
So the challenge is to try to discern the interplay of all these different factors
Yeah.
and to approach claims of divine revelation with a critical eye,
Yeah.
with a discerning eye.
It's tricky.
It is?
It's all very tricky. This raises some pretty profound questions, I think,
Yeah.
for people who believe in Ellen G. White's prophetic authority.
Right.
I mean, if her visions were mainly a product of her surroundings and the influential figures in her life,
Yeah.
what does that mean for the validity of Adventist doctrines?
That's a question that each individual has to kind of wrestle with.
Right.
Some might say that even if they were influenced by these human factors,
Yeah.
her visions still contain valuable insights and guidance. Others might find their faith challenged.
Yeah.
They start questioning the very foundations
Right.
upon which Adventist beliefs are built.
Right.
There's no easy answers here.
Yeah.
It really comes down to one's own personal interpretation of the evidence.
It's been quite a deep dive.
It has.
We've explored some pretty controversial ideas.
We have.
Uncovered some maybe uncomfortable truths.
Yeah,
But I think this whole exploration has been really valuable.
I agree.
It's pushed us to think critically about the nature of prophecy,
Yes.
the formation of religious beliefs, and the complexity of human influence.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's important to engage with these difficult questions,
Yeah.
even if they make us uncomfortable, even if they challenge our preconceived notions.
Absolutely.
A real search for understanding requires us to be open
Yeah.
to different perspectives
Absolutely.
and to weigh the evidence carefully.
Well said. And for our listeners out there, if this deep dive has kind of sparked your curiosity,
Yes.
we encourage you to keep exploring this.
Absolutely.
Read Ellen G. White's writings. Delve into the history of the Adventist Church.
Yeah.
Examine the arguments from both sides of this debate.
It's a fascinating journey.
It really is.
Very intellectually stimulating,
Yeah.
and it can really deepen our understanding of religion history and the human condition.
Absolutely. And ultimately, maybe the biggest takeaway from this whole deep dive
Yeah.
is the importance of critical thinking and open-mindedness.
Absolutely.
Let's approach all claims of divine revelation,
Yes.
whether it's from Ellen G. White or any other religious figure,
Yeah.
with a healthy dose of skepticism
Yeah.
and a willingness to consider alternative explanations.
It's about engaging in that thoughtful and respectful dialogue,
Right.
acknowledging the complexities of history and recognizing that our understanding of faith and spirituality is always evolving.
Absolutely. Well said.
Yeah.
And with that, we'll leave you to ponder the many questions we've explored today.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive
Thank you.
into the life and legacy of Ellen G. White.
You've been listening to Postum SDA Cast. We hope you enjoyed the conversation. Don't forget to check out our other episodes, and we'll see you next time for more bold takes and fresh perspectives.